Hey there! If a person goes bankrupt, they might lose their house, their car, and everything they own. If a business goes bankrupt, it shuts down, lays off workers, and maybe gets sold off. But what about a country? Well, you've heard the news your country is drowning in debt, yet it keeps borrowing and borrowing more. So what happens when a government runs out of money and can't pay its debt? You don't see it getting evicted. The country doesn't get closed. The country is still there. So in this video, we'll talk about what country bankruptcy or default really means, why countries go into default, what happens when they do, whether a country can recover from it, and whether rich countries can default too. Well, let's get started. Section 1. What does country bankruptcy actually mean? When people say a country is bankrupt, what they usually mean is actually called a default. A default is when a country misses a debt payment, delays it, or says they won't pay at all. But unlike people or businesses, countries don't go to bankruptcy court. There's no legal process, no judge, and no one comes to take the government's office furniture away. The country is still there. People still live there. The president still goes on TV. So what actually happens? What collapses isn't the country itself, it's the trust. Investors and lenders stop believing the government can pay its debts. And when that happens, it becomes much harder for the country to borrow money. It is harder to import key stuff like fuel or medicine. Sometimes it even has to give up control of its own assets to survive, like when Sri Lanka leased its Hambantota port to China in 2017 after struggling to repay project loans. So a country default doesn't mean the nation disappears. It means confidence in that country disappears. And when that goes, everything else gets harder. Section 2. Why do countries default? Well, as most of you already know, corruption and mismanagement are definitely big reasons why a country ends up defaulting. But that's not the whole story. There are many other factors that play a role. The first problem is when governments borrow more than they can handle. Of course, it's obvious. Can't pay debt, get default. This usually happens when they take out too many loans too fast. At first, it seems fine. They can still make the payments. But over time, the interest adds up and starts compounding. Eventually, a huge chunk of the budget goes into paying debt, leaving very little for anything else. This is called a debt trap. So in the end, it's really just a cycle of robbing Peter to pay Paul, meaning the country takes on new debt to pay off old debt and keeps repeating that cycle until they can't find new lenders and finally default. Second is currency's value drop. Things get even worse when countries borrow in foreign currencies, especially US dollars. That's actually pretty common because global lenders prefer to lend in dollars, since the US dollar is the world's reserve currency. But it creates a huge burden for the borrower. The government earns revenue in its local currency, but it has to pay back in dollars. As I explained in my video, Why Do Some Countries Want Weaker Currencies? Link in the description. If their currency drops in value, they suddenly need way more of it just to buy the same amount of dollars. Another reason is when something major hits the economy, like a war, a global pandemic, or a crash in the price of a country's main exports. Venezuela is a perfect example. It depended almost entirely on oil. When oil prices crashed, the government's income dropped hard. Combined with sanctions, corruption, and mismanagement, they started printing huge amounts of money to cover the gap. That caused hyperinflation and eventually default. And then there's political chaos. It's when governments keep changing policies. One government takes on debt. The next refuses to pay. That's exactly what happened in Ecuador. In 2008, President Rafael Correa called part of the country's debt illegitimate and defaulted on purpose. Not because they had no money, they just didn't want to pay. Section 3. What happens when they default? When a country defaults, it doesn't always look dramatic at first. Sometimes it starts with something small, like missing one payment or asking to delay interest. But even that's enough to send a message: something's wrong. Once the news gets out, credit rating agencies usually react fast. They downgrade the country's score, which is basically like saying, this government can't be trusted to pay on time. If the cut is sudden or severe, investors often panic because now they're worried the government won't be able to repay them. So they start pulling their money out fast from currency, bonds, and stocks, and any other assets tied to the country. And when a lot of people try to sell at once, they compete to sell the stocks, currency, and other assets cheap, just to get out as quickly as they can. So the value of the country's currency drops hard. Now, everything the country imports becomes way more expensive. Oil, food, medicine, all of that usually has to be bought using foreign currency. But now it takes more and more local money just to get the same amount of dollars. This causes massive product shortages and all prices go up. That's when inflation kicks in. Prices rise every week. Shelves go empty. Power cuts become common. As prices keep rising, people need more money just to survive. Some are afraid that their accounts might get frozen any day. Others panic that their savings will disappear. So they rush to withdraw cash. But the banks don't have enough money to give everyone. This causes a bank run. Some banks start freezing accounts and delaying withdrawal. Some collapse. And once one bank goes down, people start panicking that other banks might be next. So they pull out even more money. One collapse leads to another. The whole system starts falling like dominoes. Businesses can't get loans. Factories shut down. Workers get laid off. And just like that, the real economy starts falling apart. All these problems hit regular people the hardest. So they protest. Some riot, and the whole country falls into chaos. That's why countries usually do everything they can to avoid defaults, even if they're broke. Not because someone will sue them or send in the police, but because even one delayed payment can trigger a domino effect that crashes the economy and destroys trust. And if no one trusts the government anymore, no one will lend to them again for years. Section 4. Can a country recover? So if a country defaults, is that the end of the story? Not really. Some countries do recover, but the road is usually long and painful. After a default, most governments are cut off from normal borrowing because nobody wants to lend to them anymore. It's like that one friend who's known for never paying people back, and now they're asking you for money again. Of course you won't lend it. Same logic. So usually, the country has to restructure its debt first, meaning they ask for more time to pay, or even ask lenders to forgive part of it. That's called a haircut. And yes, lenders hate it. But that's usually not enough. They need more money. So organizations like the IMF, which gives emergency loans to nations in crisis, the World Bank, which funds long-term development and infrastructure, or the Paris Club, a group of rich governments that offer to delay or restructure debt payments. These groups usually step in when things go bad. But this help doesn't come for free. These deals usually come with strict conditions, often called Austerity. Austerity is when the government is told to raise taxes, cut spending, or sell state-owned assets like airports, oil companies, or utility firms in order to get more money. And people inside the country almost always hate it because it feels like selling off your country's pride, sovereignty, and modern colonization. Not only that, it can also lead to public workers losing jobs. Subsidies get cut. Prices go up even more. And it's not just about money, it's about trust. Even if the debt is restructured, it takes years to convince investors to come back. The country has to prove it is stable again, that it can manage its budget, that it won't default a second time. It's literally like your debt-ridden friend trying to prove he's changed and won't mess it up again. Some countries do pull it off though. Argentina has defaulted multiple times and still finds ways to borrow again. Greece slowly climbed back after years of painful reforms. And Sri Lanka, after defaulting in 2022, it reached a deal with the IMF and started recovering. In fact, one of the best recovery cases in modern times is Uruguay. In 2002, Uruguay faced a massive bank run triggered by Argentina's crisis, which pushed the country to the brink of default. With urgent help from the IMF, an emergency loan from the United States, plus serious debt restructuring and major reforms, Uruguay bounced back. Uruguay became one of the most credit-worthy countries in South America after Chile, and one of the most developed too. A rare success story. So yes, a country can recover, but not easily and not quickly. Section 5. Can rich countries default too? Now you might wonder, if poor countries can default, what about rich countries? Can the US go bankrupt too? As I mentioned before, most global lenders lend money in US dollars since it's the global reserve currency. So technically, the US borrows money in its own currency, the US dollar. That means it can always just print more dollars to repay its debt, as only US can print US dollars. Yeah, this is basically the unique privilege the US has when it comes to its debt. But printing too much money creates its own problem. If you print too much, it leads to inflation. And if too many dollars flood the economy compared to demand, the dollar's value can drop sharply, which is also dangerous. In fact, the US has already faced moments where it came close to default, but due to political reasons. In 2011 and again in 2023, the government almost defaulted because politicians were fighting over raising the debt ceiling. The US has a system called the debt ceiling, which means they can't borrow more than a set limit and are supposed to start managing their debt. But the funny thing is, the US just keeps increasing the ceiling so it can keep borrowing to avoid default. Just the threat of default was enough to shake the markets and lower America's credit rating. In 2011, one of the big credit rating agencies, Standard & Poor's, downgraded the US from AAA to AA+ just days after a debt ceiling crisis. They said the US looked too unstable and didn't have a clear plan to manage its debt. Then, in 2023, another agency called Fitch also downgraded the US to AA+ after politicians once again waited until the last minute to make a deal. So, even though the US never actually defaulted, the fact that it came close was enough to damage its reputation. Japan is another special case. It has one of the highest debt levels in the world, over 200% of its GDP, but it still hasn't defaulted. Why? Because most of its debt is owned internally by Japanese institutions like the central bank and its own citizens. So they have a lower risk of foreign default. On top of that, inflation in Japan stays low, and the economy is stable. So yes, rich countries can still face default risk, but it usually comes from politics or a collapse in confidence. So in conclusion, a country cannot go bankrupt in the way a person or company does. There's no court, no foreclosure. The flag is still there. But when a country defaults, the effects can be just as painful or even worse. It's not about the money running out. It's about trust collapsing. Because the moment people lose faith in a government's ability to pay its debt, investors flee. The currency sinks. Imports get expensive. Inflation spikes. Banks fail, and jobs disappear. And it's the everyday people who suffer most. That's why most governments are terrified of default. Not because they'll get sued, but to maintain trust. And once that breaks, so does everything else. Help us keep making videos like this by becoming a member, and unlock some exclusive perks too. If you want me to make other videos explaining these topics, please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.